Before the story begins, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know. What time do you usually watch videos? And don't forget to suggest the next story or content you'd like to see. Story 1. The apartment door that opened at 3 a.m. When Mia first moved into her new apartment, she wasn't looking for anything fancy, just something affordable, close to work, and safe enough to let her sleep at night without worry. The building she chose was an old brick complex, built sometime in the 1940s, with long, narrow hallways that smelled faintly of dust and cleaning chemicals. The landlord had assured her the locks had all been replaced, state-of-the-art deadbolts as he proudly called them, though Mia noticed the frames around the doors were still warped with age. She had lived there peacefully for about 2 months before the first night it happened. At precisely 3 a.m., she woke to the sharp sound of a metallic click. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to snap her out of a dream. Disoriented, she sat up in bed and stared across the room toward her front door. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, a living space, and that single door leading to the hallway. From where she lay, she could see the faint outline of the entry through the glow of a street lamp outside. The knob was turning. It turned slowly, deliberately, as if someone on the other side was testing it. Her heart raced, but before she could even stand, she heard the deadbolt snap free. The door creaked open a few inches, no more than a hand's width, and then nothing. No footsteps, no figure. Just the eerie quiet of her apartment, broken only by the steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchenette. Terrified, she grabbed her phone and called the building's security number. A groggy guard came up, checked the hallway, and insisted there was no one there. He tightened the bolt, assured her it must have been a mechanical slip, and left. Mia tried to convince herself it was exactly that. But deep down, she felt it hadn't been an accident. The second time, it happened again at exactly 3 a.m. She had set an alarm for 2:50 a.m., almost as if she were daring herself to be awake when it occurred. She sat on her couch, eyes locked on the front door, her phone recording in her trembling hands. At the stroke of 3, she heard the sound again, the faint scrape of metal against metal, the steady twist of the knob, and the click of the lock releasing. This time, the door opened wider. The gap yawned open nearly a foot, allowing a slice of the dark hallway to show. Her recording caught nothing but shadows, yet she swore she saw movement, a flicker, as though someone was standing just beyond the threshold, too far into the dark to be revealed. She whispered out loud, "Who's there?" But no answer came. The door simply swung until it stopped, and then hung still, like a gaping mouth frozen mid-sentence. By morning, the video showed only an empty hallway and a door creaking open. The landlord brushed it off again, saying maybe her unit's frame was expanding in the night air. Still, she changed her locks. Twice. She even added a chain herself. None of it mattered. On the third night, she decided she wouldn't just sit and watch. She stacked a chair against the inside of the door, braced with her small bookshelf. "If it opens tonight," she muttered to herself, "it'll have to push through this." The plan made her feel a little safer as she climbed into bed. At 3 o'clock sharp, she heard the sound again. Click, scrape, turn. Her eyes flew open in time to hear the chain rattle and the chair legs squeal across the floor. The bookshelf wobbled violently, as though someone on the other side were pushing hard against it. She leapt from bed, screaming, "Stop! Leave me alone!" The noise ceased instantly. She stood in silence, trembling, staring at the door that now stood perfectly still, until she noticed something chilling. The chain, which had been looped securely in place, was dangling free. By the 4th night, Mia was nearly hysterical. Sleep-deprived and desperate, she invited her friend Carla to stay over. Carla, skeptical but supportive, agreed. Together they sat awake in the dark, whispering nervously as the clock ticked closer to 3. When the minute struck, the familiar sound began. The knob twisted, the bolt released. Carla's eyes widened in disbelief as the door creaked open, just as Mia had said. But this time, something new followed. Breathing. Low, rasping, uneven breaths filled the room, though no one stood in the doorway. The sound seemed to seep in like smoke, surrounding them, growing heavier, until Carla grabbed Mia's arm and shouted, "Shut it! Shut it now!" They slammed the door, locked it, and shoved the chair back in place. The breathing stopped instantly. Carla left the next morning, refusing to return. In the weeks that followed, Mia begged the landlord to let her break her lease. She even offered to forfeit her deposit, but he refused, coldly stating she had signed a contract. She stopped sleeping entirely, too afraid to close her eyes, knowing what would happen at 3 a.m. The breaking point came when, one night, she didn't hear the usual sounds. She thought, prayed, that it was finally over. But then she realized something worse. The door wasn't opening. It was already open. When she turned in bed, the glow of the streetlight showed the door wide, wider than it had ever been before, exposing the hallway in its entirety. And this time, she saw it. Saw them. A figure stood there. It wasn't shadow or smoke or imagination. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with its head grazing the top of the frame, its face obscured in darkness. The only thing visible were its hands, pale and long-fingered, clutching the edges of the door as if savoring the moment it had been waiting for. The clock on her nightstand ticked to 3:01, and the door clicked shut from the inside. Story 2. The motel room lock that clicked on its own. Daniel had always been a practical man. He wasn't the type to jump at shadows or indulge in ghost stories. When his work as a traveling equipment technician sent him from city to city, he learned to make peace with dimly lit motels, creaky beds, and paper-thin walls. A locked door, he believed, was all that stood between him and the chaos of the outside world. And that was enough. Or at least, it used to be. It was late autumn when his company booked him into a roadside motel off an empty stretch of highway in Indiana. The sign out front flickered with only half its letters glowing, and the parking lot was nearly deserted except for his sedan and an old pickup with no license plate. The lobby smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, masked poorly by air freshener. The man at the desk, gaunt with pale skin, stretched too tight over sharp cheekbones, slid Daniel a key card with little more than a nod. Room 6. Ground floor. Daniel wheeled his suitcase down the narrow corridor, the carpeting stained and uneven. His room was ordinary at first glance. 2 double beds with stiff floral blankets, a small desk, a television bolted to the wall, and a single window with thin beige curtains that didn't quite close all the way. He locked the door, tested the handle twice, and settled in for the night with his laptop, trying to finish reports before another long drive in the morning. By midnight, exhaustion set in. He turned off the lamp, crawled under the scratchy covers, and closed his eyes. For a while, the hum of the air conditioner was the only sound. Then, click. Daniel's eyes snapped open. It was the unmistakable sound of the door lock unlatching. He sat up instantly, staring at the door in the dim glow of the parking lot light filtering through the curtains. His heart hammered as he reached for the lamp, flicking it on. The lock was in place. The metal latch was still across. He told himself it was just his imagination, the walls settling, or maybe even the air conditioning unit making strange noises. But as the silence deepened, he swore he could feel the weight of the room change, like the air itself had shifted. Eventually, he lay back down, convincing himself it was nothing. At 1:17 a.m., it happened again. Click. This time, Daniel was certain the sound came from the lock. He stared, unblinking at the door, watching for the slightest movement. The lock still appeared engaged. He forced himself out of bed, bare feet sinking into the cold carpet, and approached cautiously. He touched the metal latch, still warm from his earlier check. Nothing was out of place. Yet as he stood there, hand resting on it, he felt a subtle vibration, as though something on the other side was testing it, pressing gently against the door. He stayed awake until exhaustion finally pulled him under. When he woke at 3 a.m., the air conditioner had gone silent. The room felt unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that presses against the eardrums. He sat up, and in that precise moment, click. The lock slid open on its own. The sound was sharp, deliberate, not the groan of metal or the warping of wood. Daniel froze, staring as the latch dropped, and the handle turned a fraction of an inch. The door shivered in its frame, as though someone was pushing from the other side. He bolted upright, adrenaline flooding his veins, and rushed to the door. His hand hovered over the handle, torn between throwing it open or shoving the latch back across. He did neither. Instead, he pressed his ear against the door. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then came the faintest sound, breathing. Slow, steady, patient. Daniel stumbled back, nearly tripping over his suitcase. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp from the nightstand, and gripped it like a weapon. The lock, now hanging loose, did not reset itself. He waited, heart pounding, but the door never fully opened. The breathing faded as if retreating down the hall, swallowed by silence once again. At dawn, he packed quickly, hardly daring to glance at the door. When he returned the key card, the desk clerk looked at him with an expression that could only be described as knowing. "Room 6? The man asked, his voice low. Daniel nodded stiffly. "You're not the first." The clerk slid the register book toward him, though not for a signature, more like a record. On one page, written in shaky handwriting, were notes from previous guests. Lock clicked all night. Door opened itself at 3. Something breathing outside. One entry, scrawled in red ink, froze Daniel in place. Do not open it. No matter how much it tries. The clerk shut the book with a snap. Daniel drove away that morning without breakfast, his chest tight, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror as if the motel itself might follow him. And while he never returned to that lonely stretch of highway, the sound of that lock, sharp, deliberate, impossible to forget, would follow him long after. Because locks are meant to protect. But what happens when the thing you're keeping out is already waiting, knowing exactly when to slip inside? Story 3, the childhood bedroom that never stayed shut. When I was 7 years old, my parents gave me my own bedroom at the end of the hallway. For a child who'd always shared a space with my older brother, it felt like freedom. The room was small, just big enough for a twin bed, a dresser, and a narrow desk under the window, but it was mine. The door, though, was what I noticed first. Unlike the other doors in the house, it was heavier, almost stubborn, as if it had lived a longer life than the rest of the walls around it. The brass knob was cold, even in the summer, and the hinges groaned like something waking from a bad dream whenever I pulled it shut. The first night I slept in that room, I closed the door completely, wanting to feel safe and tucked away in my little world. Yet, when I woke in the morning, it was open, wide enough that the hall light fell in, though my parents swore they hadn't touched it. I thought maybe I hadn't latched it properly, or maybe my brother had crept in to mess with me. Kids play tricks, after all. But it kept happening. No matter how many times I pulled the door until it clicked shut, no matter how firmly I twisted the lock, I would wake up to find it ajar. At first, it was only open a sliver, just enough to show me a slice of darkness from the hallway. But over the weeks, it started opening wider. By the end of that summer, it stood open nearly halfway each morning, like someone had pushed it from the other side and paused to watch. I tried to ignore it, but there was something unsettling about lying in bed at night, hearing the faint creak of the hinges, that subtle shift of air when the door moved. I never saw it swing open. I only heard it. The sound of wood brushing lightly against carpet as though unseen hands were pushing slowly, cautiously, testing the threshold. One night, unable to stand it anymore, I decided to keep watch. I propped myself up in bed, the blankets pulled up to my chin, staring at that stubborn door. My alarm clock glowed red, ticking through the late hours. Midnight, 1, 2. At around 3 o'clock, the air in the room grew colder, the kind of chill that seeped into my bones and made the fine hairs on my arms stand upright. The door was still shut, the brass knob gleaming faintly in the moonlight that slipped through the window. Then, soundlessly, it turned. I saw it. Saw the knob shift, saw the latch slip free. The door began to move inward, inch by inch, no creak this time, no groan of old hinges, just a smooth, silent swing. My chest locked up. I wanted to scream for my parents, but my throat wouldn't work. The door stopped halfway, hanging there, like someone was standing in the hall, deciding whether or not to come in. I swear I heard breathing, not loud, not obvious. A faint, steady rhythm just beyond the frame, where the light from the hallway didn't quite reach. My eyes watered, straining to see shapes in the dark. I thought I saw the outline of a figure, tall and still, but when I blinked, the space looked empty again. The next morning, I told my parents. My father laughed and said it was settling air pressure, and my mother suggested I'd been dreaming. My brother teased me mercilessly. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, and it didn't stop. As I grew older, the ritual of the door became something I dreaded. No matter where I placed furniture, no matter how many pillows I shoved against the crack to keep it still, the door always found a way to open. By the time I was 12, I'd grown used to sleeping with the blanket pulled over my head, blocking my view of that shadowy gap. It wasn't until my grandmother came to visit that anyone took me seriously. She stayed in my room for a night, since I'd offered to sleep on the couch. The next morning, she came downstairs pale as chalk, lips pressed so tight they looked bloodless. She asked my parents if anyone had died in the house. They exchanged an uneasy glance but said nothing. I never saw her go back into that room again. Years later, as a teenager, I finally asked my father directly. He hesitated before telling me the truth. Before we moved in, the house had belonged to an older couple. Their only son had lived in that same room, the one that became mine. One night, he locked himself inside and never came out. My father's words trailed off there, but I understood enough. They had found him after breaking down the stubborn, heavy door, the same one I'd grown up with. After hearing that, the nightly opening of the door took on a different weight. It no longer felt like some trick of air or faulty latch. It felt like someone still lingering, someone unable to stay inside the space they'd chosen to leave forever. The last night I slept in that room before leaving for college, I decided to face it one more time. I closed the door, turned the lock, and sat in bed with the lamp dimmed low. Midnight came, then 1, then 2. At exactly 3, as though on cue, the knob turned. The lock clicked open from the inside, though I hadn't touched it. The door swung wide, smoother than ever before, until it stood fully open, exposing the silent hallway. And this time, I didn't just hear the breathing. I heard a whisper, a soft, broken voice that seemed to come from the very wood of the door itself. "Don't shut me in." I left the light on the rest of the night, too afraid to move. By morning, the door was still wide open, as if waiting. To this day, I can't sleep in a room with the door closed. It doesn't matter if it's a hotel, a friend's house, or my own apartment. I need the door cracked open just enough to see the world beyond. Because deep down, I know if I ever dared to shut it completely, it would find a way to open again. And I don't know what would come through this time. Story 4, the hospital storage room that let itself open. Hospitals carry a kind of stillness that feels different from anywhere else. Even when the hallways are alive with footsteps and the steady beeping of machines, there's an underlying hush, as though the walls themselves remember too much to ever be fully at peace. For Alice, a night shift nurse at St. Mary's Memorial, that silence was part of the job, something she had grown used to over her 6 years on staff. But there was one place in the hospital she never got used to, the old storage room on the west wing. It was tucked at the far end of a dim hallway where no patients were kept anymore, just across from an unused ward that had been closed down decades earlier. The room wasn't remarkable by any means. It stored old wheelchairs, IV poles, boxes of bandages, and equipment that had outlived its usefulness. But everyone on staff knew it for one peculiar reason. No matter how many times you locked it, the door had a habit of swinging open. Alice thought it was nothing more than a faulty latch, at least until the night she was the one to lock it. That evening, the hospital was unusually quiet. The ER was slow, the wards were calm, and the only real sound came from the rain hammering against the tall, narrow windows. Alice had been asked by her supervisor to fetch a set of older IV pumps stored in the West Wing, the kind rarely used but still needed in emergencies. She hated going down there, mostly because the lighting was poor and the hallway smelled faintly of mildew. Still, she carried the ring of keys, found the right one, and turned it in the storage room's lock with a definitive click. Inside, the room was cooler than the rest of the hospital. Her breath fogged faintly as she stepped in, brushing her flashlight beam across stacks of boxes. She quickly located the pumps, lifted one, and left. Before she pulled the door shut, she double-checked the lock. Click, secure. She even tugged the handle firmly, twice, to be sure. Satisfied, she left the hallway. But when she returned an hour later, the door was wide open. Her stomach dropped. She knew she had locked it. She remembered the sound, the pressure on the handle. Yet the door gaped as though it had never been closed at all. Alice peeked inside. The room was as she left it, cold, stale, and undisturbed. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, but she told herself it was just her nerves. She shut the door again, turned the key, and walked away briskly. By the end of her shift, she passed the hall again and froze. The door was open once more, just enough to reveal a slice of black interior. Over the following nights, it became a pattern. Nurses whispered about it, some laughing nervously, others swearing they'd seen movement inside. One orderly said he'd heard coughing from the room when it stood open, though no one was there. Another claimed she'd spotted an outline of someone standing among the IV poles, tall and unmoving, until the flashlight beam hit and the figure vanished. Alice, skeptical but unsettled, decided to test it herself. She waited one night until she was alone in the hall. With slow precision, she locked the door, rattled it, and pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. She started to walk away, only to hear 3 steps later a faint metallic click behind her. She turned. The door eased itself open. Her breath caught as cold air rolled out, sharper than before, smelling faintly of antiseptic and iron. She shined her flashlight inside. The beam landed on the row of stacked wheelchairs, and then something moved between them. A slow, deliberate shifting, as though someone was standing there and had just leaned slightly out of sight. Alice? A voice rasped from the darkness. Her flashlight shook in her hands. It was a man's voice, familiar, impossibly so. Her father's. But he had died 2 years earlier in that very hospital. She backed away, heart pounding, never daring to step inside. The door drifted wider, but nothing emerged. She forced herself to look one last time before running down the hall. In the beam of her light, a reflection caught, 2 pale eyes watching her from the gap between stacked boxes. The next morning, she reported it to maintenance, who replaced the lock entirely. For a time, that seemed to solve the problem. But within a week, the new lock began to fail in the same way. Staff started avoiding the hall entirely. The room was eventually welded shut, a steel plate drilled over the frame to prevent anyone from entering. Yet Alice swears that even now, when she walks past that section of the hospital, she hears faint sounds from behind the metal. The slow turning of wheels, the shuffle of feet, and, on the quietest nights, the steady rattle of someone breathing, just beyond the locked barrier. Sometimes the most terrifying things aren't the ones that break down doors, but the ones that know how to slip inside without force. A locked room should mean safety, security, and peace of mind. But what happens when the lock itself turns against you? When the very thing meant to protect you becomes the gateway to something unseen? If tonight's stories have taught us anything, it's that silence doesn't mean safety, and a closed door doesn't mean you're alone. So the next time you hear the faint click of a lock in the dark, ask yourself, was it you who opened it, or something waiting on the other side?